Good evening and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival and to the New York Times main theatre. It's fantastic to see this place packed to the gunnels, but I'm not at all surprised because of the man sitting next to me. My name is Alan Little. I'm a broadcaster and journalist, and I chair the Board of Trustees of this festival, as some of you probably already know. And it's my great treat and privilege to introduce you to the author of this book, The Burning Land, a novel. George and I got to know each other when we were stationed in Johannesburg together in the 90s during Mandela's time, and George was the bureau chief and I was pretty much his number two, and I learned, I think of it now as a golden period in my working life, because I learned a lot from him about journalism, about Africa, about television, and about personal integrity. Please welcome George Alagiah.
I've got to say, before we start, that when Alan arrived in our bureau in Johannesburg, we all realised we had to up our game. Seriously, he's been very modest.
This afternoon I interviewed Nicola Sturgeon at Beyond Borders in Traquair, and when I pulled out my notes for that interview, it said George Alagiah. But I've got the right notes with me this time. George, we were talking a little earlier, and we talked about sometimes you're able to communicate a truth that has eluded you as a journalist through the vehicle of fiction, and to some extent that is what you've done in this. What was the issue you were trying to grapple with that you had a bash at as a journalist but couldn't quite get there with?
Broadly, I think, Alan, it's what you'd call the land issue. In particular, the South African one, which is that in 1913, most of the best land in South Africa, as you know, was taken over and reserved for white people, and the black majority got to keep the other, whatever it was, 13-14%. But more generally, this relationship that people all over the world have with the land, it's visceral. They grow crops on it, their children play on it, they bury their dead in it. And what we're seeing, and what I heard was happening as a reporter, was that as climate change kicked in, as we in the West and in China, in particular India, as our diets changed, we needed more and more land to grow food, so rich countries, rich people were buying up land in poor countries in Africa. And we knew that was going on. We knew there was a truth in that. But we're journalists, and you can only report the facts, and I could never nail the facts. So a few years ago I decided, well, look, I'll tell the truth, but I'll tell it through fiction.
And the book, the main characters in the book are a group who lead a rebellion against the corruption that seeps in post-Mandela South Africa. We can see, actually, it's published by Canongate, I'm very proud to say, in Edinburgh. And we can see a little clip that Canongate have made, which is astonishing. Can we see that? So now you've got to read it. George, just before you read, the Canongate sent me a galley-proof copy in May, I think, and I took a photograph of it on my phone, and I texted George saying, "Look what I've got," and he texted back saying, "Oh my God, I'm so nervous." You were quite nervous about exposing yourself in this way as a novelist.
I think for two reasons I was nervous. One, I'd never done fiction before, and it was about the time that Canongate said yes. And suddenly the book came alive, and I wondered what on earth I'd been thinking about, straying from facts and figures, which is what I normally do in journalism. But the other thing is that this is about people, it's about characters, it's about exposing some of the things I really feel that I never get to do and probably don't want to do on telly. And it was out there, so that was the other reason I was nervous.
Give us a flavour. This is from the opening of the book.
So this is a character who the murder that clip referred to, and it's about him. Lesedi Motlanthi's murder was one of those pivotal moments that seemed destined to change the course of a country's trajectory. There are some events, a law passed, a speech delivered, a transgression exposed, which are deemed significant only in retrospect, like looking back on a life and realizing the point at which things had taken a turn for the better or worse. This was different. As news of the murder spread across South Africa, its people knew there could be no going back to business as usual. Lesedi Motlanshi was more than a man. He was an idea, a symbol, and with his death, that idea had been tarnished. Lesedi had been one of Freedom's children, born in the 80s. His life mirrored the changes in South Africa as apartheid's pernicious laws were expunged from the statutes. A quick and confident boy, he'd once been interviewed by a TV crew doing a piece on the role schools were playing in changing attitudes to race. The reporter had asked a class of teenagers to define racism. In a flash, Lesedi had stuck up his hand. He'd pointed to one of only 3 white children in the class and said, well, racism is like, if I'm unkind to Darren and call him names, Whitey and so on. The clip had made it onto the evening news. The reversal of the conventional definition of racism, that white people could be the victims too, from the lips of a black child, seemed to speak volumes for the miraculous journey South Africa was making. Now he was dead. Even in a country inured to violent crime and a murder rate that saw it perpetually leading the wrong kind of international league table, the notion that Lesedi Motlanshi would one day become a victim, another notch on the grim statistics board, was unthinkable. There wasn't a person in the country, whether they spent their time in a township shebeen or a gated mansion, who did not know who Lesedi Motlanshi was and what he represented. So who, in their right mind, would want him dead?
So it's a brave thing to do to kill off the most likable character in the book in the first sentence. But as you say, he becomes an idea as much as a character in the book.
Yeah, for me, Lesedi kind of represents the South Africa that you and I report. And Alan and I were there in the Mandela years when there was a palpable sense of optimism. And as I said, he's a child of that period. He grew up in that period. And we began to see it, I think, Alan, in the years 94 to 99. The things were beginning to go wrong, but there was this kind of blessed figure of Nelson Mandela who seemed to make everything vanish away. Now he's gone, and even when he left office, things started taking a downward turn, and Lesedi represents that downward turn. He's murdered right at the beginning.
Say a bit about Lesedi's parents, because his father is a wealthy member of a new black elite. Did you meet men like him?
I think we met lots of men like him, people who had once talked about sharing the wealth of the land amongst everybody in the country, suddenly decided they were going to share it amongst themselves within this new black elite. I think some people called them the Black Diamonds. And where they once had traded in ideology, started trading in brands and bigger houses and bigger watches and faster cars. And we definitely saw that. And the women too, this kind of the without being rude, the kind of fecund fertility and beauty of African women. Suddenly you saw them trying to sort of fit themselves into a kind of a European model of beauty. And these people are still there and they hold sway.
Lesedi's mother, though, emerges as a very powerful and admirable character. Who were you drawing on for her?
I don't know if anyone here will remember, but one of Mandela's great friends was a man called Walter Sisulu. He was his mentor, in fact, and his wife, Albertina, came through all of this exactly as she was when she joined the freedom struggle. And Priscilla Motlanshi, so Lesedi's mother, is that woman, steadfast, resilient, a love of freedom that never ever wavered. And as you say, she's a big piece of this book.
Mm. I met Sisulu once in Soweto, and he was the most modest, unassuming character. Did you meet him?
I
Walter
did,
Sisulu?
yes.
And Albertina?
I didn't actually. I saw her many times.
Yeah.
Didn't interview her.
Yeah. The other issue that it grapples with very powerfully is xenophobia, the othering of minorities and scapegoating of people who don't look like you or speak like you and who you think don't belong in your country. Why did you want to... And there's another passage that I'd like you to read.
What I and you will have seen this, I know, and you've written a book about this in Bosnia. This thing we call civilization, I think we both know is about that deep.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't take much, actually, for people to turn on the other. And what happens in this book is that there is this murder, and the authorities, in their desperation, blame it on a what I call a character in the book called a shirtless Mozambican. And suddenly, not just Mozambicans, but every foreigner in South Africa is seen as a suspect. And there are plenty of foreigners in South Africa. They, like in this country, they work in the sort of shadowlands of the economy, you know, the night workers, the shift workers, and so on. And the public turn on them. And let me just, can I read this? I was trying to describe how that process can happen, and one of the characters in this, in the book, has just going to the funeral of Lesedi Motlanshi, and just before the funeral, she goes to buy a Coke or something, and talks to a shopkeeper who says to her, "Oh, all these Mozambicans must be sent back," and this is what's going through her mind. Walking back towards Regina Mundi, Lindy replayed the shopkeeper's words in her mind. Send them back to Maputo. How many times, in how many different countries, and in how many different languages had these words, send them back, been used? And how many people around the world had heard them and been terrified by what they meant? Those three words robbed them of their identities as individuals, as families and neighbors, even as friends. Them, not us. Them over there. Search them, catch them, arrest them, deport them, kill them. That was all it took. Shift the people from the column marked us to the one marked them, and everything became possible, justifiable. Lindy found those words spoken by the avuncular figure of the smiling, seemingly gentle shopkeeper as chilling as anything she'd read in the frenetic messages or the ticker tape headlines on the news channels.
Thank you. Yeah, as you say, I mean, twice in my reporting life, I've reported events that were later described by international courts as genocide. One in Bosnia, and the other one with you in Rwanda. We've spent a lot of time in the aftermath of the Rwandese genocide, and what's most chilling about it is that it doesn't take long for people who are committing genocide to come to think of themselves as serving a public good, of actually doing something virtuous. And that was the case in Rwanda, wasn't it?
It's the case in Rwanda, and you know, this is not you, but me. You'd think it's incredibly easy to recognize genocide and the people who commit it. You'd think it was easy, but I remember there was a period when a huge population, about 1 million people from Rwanda, fled to neighboring what was then Zaire, today Congo. And amongst those, in fact, the majority of those people had been in some way connected to the genocide. Some of them had wielded the machetes, others had watched, others had maybe pointed the finger at someone. And they came into this place, and the aid agencies turned up, and cholera started whipping through the camp. And about day 3 of this, I remember thinking of my report and saying, hang on a minute, how are they, I'd lost sight of the fact of who these people were. That amongst their number was an army, the soldiers had taken their uniforms off. Among their number were people who'd been part of the genocide. And yet, probably if you were watching here in Scotland or in London, England, wherever, you might have thought these were the victims. And it was a massive lesson for me, that period, as a reporter, and just how careful one has to be, and how you have to keep in mind what it is you're looking at, and not just get carried away by these images of aid workers carrying people off in stretchers because they had cholera.
I remember getting off the plane, and the perimeter of the airport was protected by barbed wire, and on the other side of that barbed wire, people were literally dying on the ground in front of us. And it was my old friend Christiana Amanpour from CNN, who I'd known in Bosnia. She saw me within an hour of my arriving. She said, "You've got a moral compass. Don't forget, every time you write a line about this, remember that the people who committed the genocide are among this crowd." But they came to be perceived by the general public and even by people on our news desks in London as having fled the genocide.
As having been the victims.
Yeah, and they were, about being the victims, yeah.
I mean, in my own defence, I did, because I looked this, I felt very guilty actually about this, so I did look up all my scripts of that period, and there was, I don't know, day 2 or 3, there was a script that said, here is an army in exile, people in exile, and watch out, this is going to be...
But it was complicated because among them were children who were not guilty of genocide, and they were dying of cholera as well. Let's go back briefly to our time in South Africa under Nelson Mandela. When I think of it now, I think of it as a kind of golden period. People used to ask me, well, but what happens if Nelson Mandela dies? And I remember Mandela complaining that he was the only head of state in the world who had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go for a walk in order to shore up the value of the currency. And it became a kind of taboo to be critical or pessimistic about South Africa. Do you remember that?
Totally. There was I actually had a slightly different take. I mean, people saw Mandela as this miraculous thing, and indeed he was. He was a figure of towering moral authority. But there was this sense around that somehow Africa never produced anyone like him before. And of course, if you knew Africa's history, I mean, there was nobody quite like Mandela, but there'd been other people who'd tried. Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, people who'd tried to reconcile white and black colonialists and the people they governed. And it was just that Mandela did it better and in a more committed way and for longer and more eloquently than anybody else. But it was quite difficult. And I'm not sure how hard I certainly even tried to really examine his record, but I think it was clear by year 3 and 4 of our stay there that what was happening was he, as I said earlier, he simply made the problems go away. There was the magic of Mandela, but I think we were beginning to see the kind of thing that this book is about.
I mean, one of my stock answers for people who said, yeah, but what happens what replaces Mandela if he dies? And he was he'd done 27 years in jail. It had taken its toll on his health. He was in his 70s before he got out of jail. It was another 4 years before he got to become leader. But I used to reply, well, what replaces South Africa? What replaces Mandela is something South Africa's never really had, which is a government of popular legitimacy and the rule of law. And to some extent, that did work, because South Africa, since Mandela, has twice constitutionally removed a president against his will.
And it's not as rare as it used to be, but it's still a pretty rare thing, to have this peaceful transfer of power. And in this book, the people who are resisting what's going on are civil society, and that's still strong. And we see it today. What's been going on in Hong Kong, elsewhere, how important it is. And I'm also reminded of just the whole climate catastrophe and what Extinction Rebellion and people like that are doing, keeping things to the fore, how important it is to have civic society, because quite often actually you cannot rely on the government. I mean, certainly there'll be many people in South Africa who will tell you they don't feel they can any longer rely on the government to bring about the transformation that they were promised in 1994.
Let's go back to the book, because there's the one last passage I'd like you to read, which recalls that time. And we need to talk, after you've read it, we'll talk a little about what has happened to the spirit of the Mandela years, especially among those who don't really remember Nelson. But there's a whole generation now in adulthood who don't really remember Mandela, far less the fact that he was in prison for 27 years.
I mean, this book is about how things have gone wrong in South Africa. In a wider sense, it's about how things have gone wrong in so many developing countries in the developing world, where politicians who ought to be protecting their land, protecting their people, find it easier to pocket some money and sell their land to the rich, to the private equity merchants, and so on. And there's a character there who it takes part in an event, a sort of gathering between white and black, and for him it resonates. For him, it's something he clings on to. it's like a dream for him that he's able to cling on to. He remembered the time when he'd helped to organise an end-of-harvest braai, South Africa's version of a barbecue, on a farm right on the border with Mozambique. It was the first year of a profit-sharing scheme that Kagiso had helped put together. The area had been blessed with good rains and bountiful crop. That evening, as a blood-orange sky had turned purple, as shadows grew longer and fainter, till they just seeped away into the soil, one of the migrant workers had brought out his mbira, a traditional handheld musical instrument, a finger piano as some called it. Kagiso had sat on the edge of the group, entranced by this vision of a different future. The farmer and his wife, Afrikaners both, sat near the fire. On the other side of the circle, their children huddled next to the housemaid and some of the workers' children. An old man, rheumy eyes staring into the embers, pulled at a zol, a homemade cigarette spiced with the comforting fragrance of dagga. Women spread polyester blankets over their bare legs, and young men shared the last few bottles of beer. Calloused thumbs plucked at the metal tines of the mbira, shaped like the flat handles of tablespoons, and picked out a tune that had been written in another century, in the great language of the coast, Swahili. Nobody understood the words, but all were moved by the ballad, the lament of a young suitor who knows he will not wed his angel, his malaika, for want of a good fortune. Kagiso had looked across at the farmer and was sure he'd seen the man's eyes well up with a tenderness so far removed from the caricature of his people. The morning, he knew, would expose again the starkness of his country's struggle to find a middle ground between great wealth and great poverty. But for that evening, under that deep and star-studded African sky, Kagiso let himself dream, yes, dream, of another country, one in which hope triumphed over despair and idealism scored a victory over cynicism.
Yeah, that was the country we lived in those years, a country that was allowing itself to dream and believe in that the arc of history inclines towards justice, to quote Martin Luther King. And let's talk about this, the so-called born-free generation, the ones who don't remember the struggle, who don't remember Mandela as president, never mind in prison. A kind of cynicism has taken root.
Well, I mean, I think you'll be as shocked as I was when I heard this. Some South African friends staying with us in London just a couple of weeks ago said there is a generation who sort of goes around saying, what did that old man ever do for us? I mean, imagine that. We are, 25 years from Freedom Day, and therefore 29 years from the day he walked out of jail. And there are young people asking that question. There's a play that's, I think, still running in London. It's about to close. If it ever comes up to Edinburgh, absolutely go and see it. It's called Tree by Kwame Kwei-Armah, written by him. And in it, it's about the land issue, actually, in a much more poetic look and historical look at the land issue in South Africa. And there's a character gets up, and have we passed this threshold? I don't know, the watershed or whatever.
Yeah, it's a watershed.
Where, there's a character that stands up and says, fuck Mandela. And you just thought, I never thought I would hear this in a theatre, let alone anywhere else. And it is because there are people already forgetting what it was about, what that man was about. So cynical have people become, so despondent have people become, which is why you get, at the moment, there are several, the ANC still just won the elections in May, but by, I think, the smallest margin it's ever had. But on the fringes, there are all sorts of people circling around, people who want to, and land is one of the things, expropriate the land, and we know where that goes, without compensation. We know what happens there when you look at what happened in Zimbabwe and so on. And if they don't, you mentioned the phrase moral compass. Well, if you don't have that moral compass, I mean, if you don't have that figure of Mandela saying, hang on a minute, there's a way through this, there's a right way to do this. Yes, land has to be transferred, but there's a right way to do this. Well, if you've just rejected that, then all sorts of things can happen.
I'm going to come back to the book in a second to get you to talk about some of the characters, especially the four conspirators and what they're up to. But as you're talking there, I remembered going back in those years to an event in Durban when, it was a little later actually, it was during Thabo Mbeki's presidency, when the then Indian Foreign Minister, Jaswant Singh, was on a panel with the South African Foreign Minister, Nkosazana Zuma, and somebody from the floor said, you come from the oldest post-colonial democracy, and you've got sitting beside you the foreign minister of the youngest. What advice does your old Indian democracy give to this new South African democracy? And he said two things: narrow the gap between promise and delivery, between what you promise at elections and what you're able to deliver in the real world. And secondly, I've completely forgotten the second thing.
I wasn't there. I can't help you out.
It's the most important thing. Oh, it's gone from my mind. I'll come. God, what an idiot. This is my 11th event at this festival. I'm running out of puff. Thanks for bearing with me. It'll come back to me. Tell us about the four conspirators.
So what happens in... I mentioned Hong Kong, for example, and what started off as essentially a peaceful protest, we're beginning to see on the fringes all sorts of people tagging on, and some of them with I think more violent ideas about protest than others. And there's a group of people in South Africa in this book, in the Burning Land, who want to do something about what they consider to be the utterly unfair sale of land. This thing that I talked about, this soil, where they've spilt their sweat, their blood onto this soil, and people are selling it. So this cell gets together, and there are four people, and the important thing about them is that they're young. They too have become cynical, and there's a dynamic between these four characters. One of them, white, and he's kind of in it because for him it's atonement. His parents made a huge amount of money, and he just wants to atone for those sins. There's another one, and I don't want to give too much away, but there's another one who feels he ought to do the right thing. But when he sees where it goes, when he sees how you can lose control of protest, when suddenly there's murders and things going on, much worse than they had planned, he then has to check himself. And then there's this a woman, and her father has been on Robben Island, and she is gutsy. She feels protest, not in the heart, not in the head, but she feels it in the gut, and she's driving this thing. And I just thought it was interesting to look at and examine the dynamics of protest, how something forged in idealism can further down the line end up with some of the most horrific violence, and that's what I was trying to do anyway.
It's beautifully realised. The four conspirators.
Oh, there's a fourth one. Yeah,
they have to trust each other because they're taking risks with their lives, because there are people who want them dead, but they're all in it for different reasons, and so they all react differently to the way the movement gets out of control. I've remembered the second thing. He said, there are 20 years ahead of you in which it will be impossible for you to lose an election no matter what you do. You arrive at this moment with such enormous moral authority that for a whole generation you will be in power. Take the tough decisions early. Take the unpopular decisions now, and don't squander the moral capital that you've got. It was such a wise...
Yeah.
It was such a moment of wisdom that it I was going to say it stuck with me, but it clearly didn't. George, there's a lot of violence in this book as well. How did you feel about writing that violence?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I didn't invent it. I have seen all of it. And to go back to the point I was making earlier, the reason that it had to be in there, and I recognise there are 3 or 4 episodes of violence in it, and I've written them up in a very vigorous way, and I felt it had to be in there because, again, this is what can happen when, as I said, this thing we call civilization gets stripped about. I mean, who would have thought that in Europe in the 1990s, rape would become a weapon of war? Well, it happened. It happened, in our continent, in our time. And I didn't think, or this is a work of fiction. I didn't think those bits are actually very real, and they were very real to me writing them. I found them difficult because, of course, in television, we've got rules about that kind of violence. I mean, very literally. I mean, for example, as Alan will remember, when you arrive at something violent, you're allowed to, your camera crews are told, you can pull out of a violence and you can't pull into into a body or something like that. But I felt it was necessary here to show it in its horror.
And it's important to point up the gender dimension to this, because that was very, very evident. I remember going to Baragwanath Hospital with our mutual friend Kate Payton, who was killed in Somalia, to my great grief and yours. And she was a wonderful, wonderful journalist and a great human being. And Kate and I went along to Baragwanath maternity ward in Soweto and met this young woman who she had already had a 16-year-old, and she had just had a baby, and she had learned during her pregnancy that she was HIV positive, and she'd dealt with it, and they were now using her as a counsellor to other young women who found out during pregnancy that they were HIV positive. And this was at a time before drugs were available in South Africa, before the antiretrovirals were available. And so she was interviewing me. She agrees to give me an interview for radio, but not for television, because she doesn't want to show her face or give her name. And I said to her, "How did your husband react when you told him?" She said, "I can't tell him. Are you crazy?" And it was a moment of jaw-dropping revelation for me, because it was probably his sexual behavior that had brought HIV into the house. And she knew that if she told him, he would kick her out of the house. And there, in that graphic snapshot, was the gender dimension to domestic violence, HIV, and almost every aspect of life.
And the thing about that HIV, and you're right, I mean, yes, she probably contracted it from her husband, but South Africa, not in exactly the same way as it did during the apartheid years, but has a lot of migrant workers. And businesses depend on this. They move cheap labor around, put them into male-only hostels, that kind of thing. There isn't proper housing for families, and as far as I know, this sort of thing goes on. So it kind of it's so unnatural that so many families are split up. And you talk about women. All the house workers and so on in cities are women, and they often leave their families in the rural areas. And so there's lots that's going on in South Africa that anybody who's visited it, when you look at how it functions, how brilliantly, how beautiful it is, it's kept afloat by these separated families in many ways, men being migrant workers somewhere else, or and the women away from the children they love so much.
Your association with Africa doesn't start with your life as a journalist, because you moved there as a child.
Yes, so I'm a Tamil, born in Sri Lanka, and as you probably know, it's not been a great time for Tamils since, well, actually, most people think of it in terms of the civil war in the 80s, but for my parents, my family, they knew very early on in the 50s. Sri Lanka, Ceylon had become independent in 48. By the late 50s, it was obvious. And my father decided, there were all sorts of things. I mean, for example, looking ahead, he could see that there was a quota for Tamils to get to university, so Tamils would have been competing against each other to get to universities. The numbers were restricted. We'd have had to learn in our own language Tamil, but the official language was the majority language Sinhalese. So the idea was to disadvantage people like us. And we in a separate discussion, there'll be other people who say, perhaps I've misrepresented history, but that's how we felt. And so my father left, and he got a job in Ghana. And the thing about that move, I was 5 going on 6, but I knew in the way that a child can sense it, that there was something optimistic about this place, that my parents, I mean, whatever it was, that they were smiling more, they seemed happier, they seemed more confident. And so for me, from the age of 5, 6, Africa represented a land of opportunity. It was the place where things started coming right for my family. So as a reporter, when years later I went back as a reporter to Africa, I could never see it as the dark continent. I reported on what was going on and the things that were not going right, but I recognized them, and I hope it came through in my reports, that they were aberrations. They were the exception, that this wasn't Africa writ large, and no more than what happened in Bosnia spoke about all of Europe. I mean, nobody goes, would have seen what happened in Srebrenica and said, well, all Europeans are like that, and that was a difference, I think. And I hope, anyway, in my reporting, I tried to convey that. Lots of the stuff that, the trouble is, we only ever got sent to places when they were falling apart, so it's actually quite difficult. But you had to find a way of whether it was in a refugee camp, in a feeding center, you had to try to find a way of showing the dignity there was in people. And that was my starting point, that even in the worst of all time, I always think, people sort of say, you must get terribly depressed, pessimistic about your having done what you've done in Africa. And actually, I say quite the reverse, because it's only when you've been to the kind of places Alan and I have been to and met the people that we meet that you realize what this thing called the human spirit is. I've touched it, I've seen it, I've felt it. It's a powerful, powerful thing. And it resides in the heart of some woman who, in a famine, has to choose which child will I feed and which will I let go, and still retain her humanity through that. And we've seen it. And I hope that came through, in the reporting I did.
I used to watch you, because George was already a household name when I met him, and I wasn't. and I used to watch him at work. And now, when I talk to groups of young journalists just starting out, sometimes they ask me what's the most important quality that you need to be a successful foreign correspondent and war reporter. And now I answer that it's respect for the people on whose lives and pain you're reporting. And I think I learned that from you.
Oh, thank you.
And then you went back as a young reporter, not just for the BBC. Long before you joined the BBC, you went back as a young married.
Yeah, with my wife Frances and I. She got a job working with ex-combatants at a rehabilitation centre in what was then Zimbabwe, and I as a print journalist. Actually, this is another story. Of a failed promise, because we were there in the early 80s, and then being this terrible business of the 5th Brigade moving into Matabele land, and that was a scar. But actually, and I can hear myself saying this, and it's going to sound awful, but if you set that aside, and I know how difficult it is, even Robert Mugabe in those early years achieved something. The output of communal farmers, for example, grew massively. He introduced what was called hot seating. In other words, in schools, one lot of kids would leave and the seats were still hot, and another lot would come down and take their place. And I know that South Africans, till 10, 15 years ago, still had a great deal of respect for Zimbabwe's education system and so on. It was a fantastic time to be there, time, again, of optimism. And which is why when I went to South Africa, I really, really hoped that it would be different. I do think it is different, actually, because as it does in the book, the nefarious activities of the land merchants, they don't make it because of civic society, and South Africa still got that in a way in which lots of Africa doesn't.
There was a generation there at our time who had come from Zimbabwe and found work in South Africa had beaten South Africans themselves to the jobs they were after because they were educated
Yeah.
in a public school system that was the product of the early years
Yeah.
of Mugabe's. There was one young man who worked in our building, we won't name him, but you'll remember who I'm talking about, who was definitely an example of that. And he was a very bright, very hard-working man. And one of the last times I was back there, I learned that he died of AIDS.
Yeah.
I mean, it was such, and so I was saying, I had Elif Shafak, the Turkish novelist, on the stage a few days ago, and she talked about the taste of words. And when I think of South Africa now, I can taste the sort of bittersweet sensation, because my memory of it is my sense of it is very positive because of what we witnessed there, all the positive things you've been talking about, but at the same time, there's this edge of bitterness, and it's a very complicated set of feelings, and you capture that in this beautiful book of yours.
And in a way, I mean, you could have done this story, I suppose, in other countries. I mean, it's most sharply told in South Africa, but in a sense, and this I can never say this on the news at 6, but it's kind of me sort of saying, watch out, guys, because this could happen anywhere,
Yeah.
at any time, and that's. That's not the journalist in me. It's simply somebody who's learnt and been educated by what I've seen around the world, and we have to nurture this thing called civilization as if it were a flower, water it, look at it, care for it, because like a flower, it's incredibly fragile. Brush it up the wrong way and the petals fall off, and that's the end of the flower. So as I say, South Africa, the advice I was given is when you start writing fiction, write about something place it in some way that you feel comfortable with, and I certainly did with South Africa. But I see that The Burning Land is a book that's bigger than the one country we both know so well.
When Canongate sent me a proof copy of this earlier this year, I was a bit nervous, because when somebody I like as much as I like George has written a book, I think, what if I don't like it? What if it's no good? I can't lie, but I don't have to lie. I powered through this book. It's beautifully written. You had your cliche filter on. There are no cliches that have crept their way into the text. The dialogue is rich and credible and believable and very powerful. And the characters are exquisitely drawn and complicated, but very clear. So I heartily recommend this. So let's get the house lights up, and I'm sure there'll be questions for you from the floor. Put your hand right up so that I can see you.
I can't tell you how scary this is, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, when I walked in there, the thing about people sort of assume if you're on telly, they're kind of used to people, but of course, as we both in the studio, there's only one other person, the floor manager, and a bunch of robots.
There's a lady there with her hand up. Yeah, put your hand up again. Yep.
Well, I'll take that courage. And you write the book, and like outside South Africa. Do you think that sense of freedom, now and then, because outside sometimes you see clear, but when you publish such a book, what do you think the South Africa, their political side and academia, or how would they see you are contributing to, or what do you perceive your book would make a difference to South Africa?
Well, it's an interesting question, because if you ask Alan and me, and you ask lots of journalists, why did you become a journalist, especially I think among foreign correspondents, and they'll say to you, yes, to make a difference. But I think it's okay to say that the kind of journalist I am, and the kind of journalist I have to be, and quite rightly, by the way, working for the BBC, means you're constrained, and it's quite hard to make a difference when it is our duty, as I say quite rightly, to put all points of view, and fiction kind of allowed me
to come off the fence.
To come off the fence, exactly, and to try to make a difference. And I hope it is clear which side of the fence I've jumped. If you read The Burning Land,
there's a character called Two Boy, and we had a great colleague and friend called Milton.
Yeah.
Two Boy. He had a brother called Two Boy.
Yeah.
And I once went on a trip to Burkina Faso with Milton as my producer and a cameraman called Byron.
Yeah.
And when I introduced them, this is Milton, this is Byron, somebody said, And you're going to write the script?
Can I tell a story about Tutu
Yes,
and
go on.
names?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's quite good. First time I went to the Archbishop's Palace in Cape Town to interview Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Tutu. You know what an impish kind of character he is. He had someone standing next to him, and I said I didn't have a Milton and a Byron, but I had a Glenn and a Milton actually. So I said, "This is Archbishop, this is Glenn, this is Milton, and this is Jerry Chibani." And Tutu turned around to me and said, "Well, my name is Tutu, and this is number 222."
Yeah. Okay, I've got a Tutu story as well. I interviewed Tutu many times over the years, and the last time I saw him was here in Edinburgh when he came to address the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. And I was invited with my wife to Holyrood because of this Africa connection. And I said to him over dinner, "You know, Bishop Tutu, the world loves you, and I've had the privilege of interviewing you many times, perhaps 14 or 15 times over the years, and you never remember me." And he went like this, he went, "Ah!" "No, you're right, I never do." And he has that perfect comic timing, which is so
Totally.
winning. There's a gentleman there.
Yes, I wanted to come back to the point you made about land redistribution, and obviously we've all seen what's happened in Zimbabwe and the tension that's building up currently in South Africa about the debate that's taking place. And you sort of said in passing, if Mandela was still around, he might say there's another way to do it. But I'm rather perplexed. Is there another way to do it? I mean, is there an inevitability that if you tackle the issue of redistribution, you bring about the kind of problems, not necessarily as bad as Zimbabwe's have been, because that was combined with a despot. But, I mean, is there a way to do land redistribution in a reasonable way?
Now, you're going to call me naive, but the other way, and who am I to put words into Mandela's mouth? But I think if he were here, he might say it's not just about taking, it's about giving. So I think the white community, the landowners, could themselves take responsibility for this process, and some of them do. By the way, you can go down to the Western Cape. There are certainly one vineyard I know, and there are others where the owners have handed over bits of their land to their workers and offered themselves as consultants and allowed them to start up their own businesses and so on. So I think that's what I meant. There's no question about it. You cannot have that much good land in the hands of a small group of people and not recognize that will cause in the end friction. And this book is what happens when that friction goes out of hand. But that, I think, is the other way, that it's got to be a communal effort, not to be seen as I'm taking this off you.
There's a hand here at the front. I'm glad, because I've got a whole lot of questions here for Nicola Sturgeon.
My question, you alluded to perfectly about, as a reporter on the television, having to be neutral and report the facts, and the books allowed you to come off the fence. Have you ever felt uncomfortably constrained by the ethical obligation you have to report the news objectively?
No, and I'll tell you what. That doesn't mean that there've been times I've had to grit my teeth and report something, or more as a presenter these days, writing the headlines, writing the cues into programs, and trying to get that balance. And the reason why I think it's okay, and the reason why I'm still comfortable doing that, because I don't think I would do it if I felt uncomfortable, is that my feeling is that we're getting a glimpse of what happens when you don't have that obligation to stand in the middle and say, look, there's an argument here, and I'm going to help you through this argument by putting both sides to it. Because just look at people's Twitter timelines, look at social media generally, look at what's happening to cable television in America, and suddenly you realize that actually you can go down this path where people only ever hear what they want to hear, and that's why, as frustrating as it can be, I think it's the right thing to do, to have an organisation that is committed in the way the BBC is to putting several points of view.
It's a very important question. It's one of the most challenging questions of our time, I think, of particularly how you report the current political situation without placing yourself on one side of the partisan divide. And that's the great challenge, because sometimes balance can be completely fake. It's a spurious moral equivalence between two positions that don't, and so you have to make a judgment about how much credibility to give one argument. So I've often felt constrained, and the BBC doesn't always get it right. Neither it's very anguished about climate change, and having for many years said, they got Steve Jones, the geneticist, in to do a report about this, to say, don't stop balancing 300 scientists with Nigel Lawson.
Yeah.
And the BBC's changed its practice on that. But the BBC doesn't set out to distort and mislead. And as a citizenry, we're going to have to start learning to distinguish, I think, between news sources that deliberately lie and distort and mislead, and those that try to get the world right but sometimes make mistakes.
Yeah.
So, are there any other questions from the floor for George? Yes, there's a lady here. Yep. And then another one there, just a couple of rows in front. Yes.
I obviously haven't had a chance to read your books. I don't know who are the purchasers of all this land. The impression I had was you probably had some sort of private equity fund or something like that. But the impression I have from what I read in the press is a far larger problem is the Chinese and perhaps the Saudis are buying up large tracts of land. Who did you choose as the people who are buying the land? And if you went for, the faceless private equity fund, which as far as I'm aware is a much smaller issue, why did you go for that and not the Chinese or the Saudis, who actually are the people who are buying up huge tracts of land in order to grow crops which they ship out, and the Chinese indeed putting their own people in?
Yeah. Actually, in the book I do talk about, this isn't journalism, so I don't labour it, but you'll certainly see mention of China, of the Gulf countries, the private equity merchants, etc. In fact, the sale of land, or the taking of land from black people by white people in South Africa is simply a gateway to the wider question. And the premise of the book is the taking of the selling of land to foreigners, and I had all those in mind, and they're certainly mentioned in the book.
But the Chinese thing is very... I remember going back to Sierra Leone, a country I had got to know well, and I went into a hotel I'd known, and all the signs were in Chinese. Suddenly.
Yeah.
But again, getting to that with a TV camera is very, very, very difficult. There's a question, a lady here, and then there's one up at the back there. Two up at the back, yes.
You spoke about this sort of reverence for and connection with the land.
Oh, hello.
Hi. And I just wondered, to what extent do you think in this country that we have kind of lost that connection and reverence for the land?
Well, I think we have, partly because so many of us live in the urban areas. We've lost touch with where our food comes from and so on. I remember I did a documentary about food security, looking at food sources and how secure they were in this country. And I remember filming with a supermarket chain and their corporate social responsibility division. And they would do these school trips, get kids in. This supermarket had its own farm, and they brought a bunch of inner city kids to this farm, and it was autumn, and the apples were growing on the tree, and this kid looked up and said, "Oh, I didn't know that's where apples came from." And the woman from the supermarket said, "Would you like to take one?" And the kid actually turned around and said, "Will it hurt me?" I mean, had just no idea that you could just pluck a fruit. So I think actually we have lost touch. And one of the things, if you look at the climate change debate in the broader sense, and people like George Monbiot and the kinds of things, and what's going on in Nepcastle, the kinds of things about rewilding and so on, it is to do with going back to a relationship with the land, because once we have that relationship, we'd want to protect it, wouldn't we? And we've just lost sight of it. So I think, and in Africa, you can still go to plenty of places where there is, as I say, this really, really deep down love for the land and what it represents, that it is a birthright.
Yeah.
You know, and we've lost that, I think, here.
Yeah, because it's about title deed now. Yes, who's got the microphone now?
I've got it. Thanks.
Oh, where are you?
At the back.
Okay, there.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
George, you were talking earlier about trying to get the balance right when you're trying to report to the news and trying to be objective. But as we all know, bad news seems to sell a lot better than good news. So I'm asking for a bit of a tip, and I'm an MP, and I'm just asking, how can we actually get good news to sell well? Because so much of our public discourse at the moment is all about the negative, and there is a fair bit of negative, to be fair. But how can we also champion some of the good stories so we can give some faith and trust back into our public discourse too?
Come on, Mr. 6 o'clock news.
Do you know, I don't think it's about good news versus bad news. The primary business of journalism is to hold people to account, and that will mean that you go to places where people are being let down. What I think we're not so good at as journalists, and by the way, this is something certainly on the news at 6 and 10, it's one team, where we've been talking about this over the last couple of years. It's not so much good news and bad news, but offering solutions, I think, and then allowing people to judge whether that's good news or bad news. But I think the concentration on problems always going in, the NHS is failing, the housing market is failing, the economy's failing, without offering enough by way of solution is, I think, something we should do more of, and probably don't do that. And there's quite a movement now, and Denmark, for example, is pioneering this in what's called solutions-based journalism. The trouble with the good news idea, just to get back to your question, is that do you really want me or Alan Little to decide what's good and bad? That's the problem, isn't it? We've all remember the Cold War, and everything was fine in the Soviet Union. Everything is fine in China. So I worry about that good news versus bad news, and that can't we show more good news? Because I don't think you shouldn't trust people like me to decide.
I'm going to take one more question. I know some other hands are up now, but we're running out of time. Yes.
Thanks. As someone who's never written fiction before, I was wondering if you could talk about the writing process, concepting it, writing it, bringing it to market. Like, what were the key challenges for you, and what were the key surprises?
That's a very good question, because writing for radio is totally different from writing for television.
Yeah.
But it's all journalism, but this is quite different.
It was, needless to say, more challenging than I thought it would be. And primarily because I had, if you like, the heart of the story, I had that, and I knew I could write, but what I hadn't worked out were things like the structure, the plotting, and so on, and that was difficult. And it was slightly more difficult because, when I first thought about it, I was obviously presenting a program and had a day job, and then the whole business of cancer came along, and I wasn't able to do anything or get my mind around anything, and then I had to pick it up after a while. So that was a slightly difficult process, but I kind of knew things were going well when I got inside the heads of my characters, and I knew I was onto something when I knew what Kahisa would do. So when it came to writing down what would he say to what Shami had said, it just kind of happened because I got into his head. And I think, far be it from me to give advice. I think it's a good book. I hope you think it's a good book, but I am a novice. But all I'm saying is, for me, once it came alive in my head, once I was able to inhabit the people, then it began to kind of there was a fluidity about it. The other stuff, the plotting and the structure is actually a simple grind. You've got to do it. And I remember listening to Hilary Mantel, not that I'm comparing myself to her, but a radio program in which she said she structures the whole thing and she's got kind of like hundreds of little bits of paper with everything done, so that when she sits down, kind of all she's got to do, but she's got to stitch together these notes. And I didn't do it that way, and I don't think there's a right way or wrong way. I had this voice, these voices that I wanted to get out, and I just let them carry me through. The danger with that, as I said, is sometimes you've got to go and rewrite and get the structure going.
One last question from me, George. When I used to go and visit George and Frances in their home in Johannesburg, one of the delightful things was that they had 2 little boys. And in the last year or so, George, you've become a grandpa.
I have. It's the best thing I've done. I get no. It's and you know, when you've been the kind of journey that I've been on with the cancer, it's so life affirming to have this lovely little girl who's just full of bounce, and well, I tell you what, it gives me a lift. It really does.
Gotta go.
Thank you.
I'm going to take George to the book signing tent next door to sign copies of this book. Please come and buy it, continue the conversation, and thank you very much once again, George Alagiah.
Thank you.